Welcome everybody. So today's topic is a very interesting way to look at things. Now history is something that's always perceived to be a particularly dry subject. Now one doesn't realize that geography coupled with history, and then when one understands these sort of little tiny bits of society and tiny bits of anthropology, or even if you don't get the whole gist of it, history and geography practically, one can actually predict future, one can actually predict, everything that's happening around us. Now today we live in an extremely interconnected world. It's as interconnected as it can get. I think it's almost sort of fascinating and scary how much each country sort of influences another country, which is both fascinating and scary at the same time, because sometimes it can be a little threatening to the sovereignty time to time. So one of the most important I think ever since the COVID has sort of stuck to the world, I think time and time again it's been a very dramatic sort of the last 3 years or whatever. I think one thing I've observed the most is that the human right violations of sort of the very large scale stuff, like whether it's a war or whether it's the Taliban attack in the Afghanistan, Taliban takeover, have been two things which have actually really been sort of a mind-boggling things, and sort of like this one sort of a really a head-turning thing that has happened in the world so far. Now Afghanistan, Taliban, how would it affect us, and all of these sort of intricacies of learning that one looks at sort of subjects in a purely dry and examination point of view. One doesn't realize that this is actually happening around us. Tomorrow you need to know if war is actually going to happen in your country. You should be prepared if the next sort of a revolution is around you, because whether you like it or not, you are being affected by all of it. So I really suggest, if any of you do not enjoy learning history or geography, or do not really understand why one should really know why the hell is sort of Ukraine fighting with Russia or Russia attacking Ukraine, why should I know all of it, what would I do? Understand that it can actually sort of affect you in a very direct way, because one thing that COVID taught you is that whether you had COVID or not was actually a much smaller problem, because it was people around you who had COVID around you that affected more. So clearly, you're not living in a world where you are alone. Everybody around you affects you directly and indirectly. Now, going very back to the world, I think, so if one talks about how did the Indian subcontinent come to existence, so India and sort of the downer part, whether it's the sort of the Central Asia, South Central Asia, I think that's the better word, South Central Asia, that is Indian subcontinent, and we also had Australia and all of these sort of the ones that are in the northern hemisphere, but also somewhere inclining towards the down side. It formed a place called Gondwana, and the classic Europe and the classic sort of America formed a place called Laurasia, and together this was called as Pangaea, which means the continents were not yet formed, and I'm talking about like some 36 million years ago or 42 million years ago something. This was a time where even human inhabitation was not really a thing. Then of course the Gondwana land very artistically became the Indian subcontinent. Now one thing that is extremely sort of a important sort of a landmark in the Indian subcontinent is the presence of the great Himalayas. Now, Himalayas are humongous, Himalayas are wide arching, Himalayas are great. And one thing Himalayas also tell you is that the fact that they are so huge that foreign invasions or cold Siberian Arctic winds that are coming really harshly from Central Asia, it's blocking them and it's giving you rainfall, so it's great. And it's overall something that's very fancy and beautiful to look at the same time it's protecting us. Now one always wonders, if Himalayas are really this huge and if this great and this sort of insurmountable barrier that there is, then why is sort of Kashmir is being targeted time and time again? Border, we always see people fighting with each other, whether it's China, India, or Pakistan, India, we're always fighting with each other in the border. If Himalayas really are this huge, humongous border that is protecting us from all the invasions, then how is it happening? Here we learn something, that just beside Himalayas is another slightly smaller altitude mountain ranges, which are the Sulaiman ranges. Now, Sulaiman ranges has these passes around us. I'm sure the image that's appearing on your screen will tell you better, is the fact that Sulaiman ranges are in the modern day Pakistan, but one also remembers that Pakistan and India were a together thing during the British era and before that, and in Indian history. So this used to be the Indian subcontinent, and then China and Afghanistan and this whole thing of Tajikistan and all of these countries above China, which is practically what we call as the Central Asia. Iran, Iraq, all of these countries, and specifically Afghanistan comes like a border between us. It's like a connecting point between Central Asia and India. Important point. Okay, swiftly coming back to the modern day world. Today we realize that we have extremely important relationships with Middle Eastern countries or Central Asia. Central Asia is a very important sort of a sphere in terms of geopolitics for us, because A, we have lots of great trade going on with them, great. B, you also realize that that's an area which is also sort of historically important to us, or also something which is also today in a very dynamic stage. So one place you're talking about China and one place you're talking about US, sort of competing each other in every sphere and sort of being these colossal enemies. And then you talk about Russia being this, sort of an expansionist, following its true blue expansionist policies in the Europe. In middle of all of this, there is a very important sphere that we belong to, which is the Indo-Pacific. And Indo-Pacific region has got strong relationships with Central Asia. Even if we don't, we should build, because that's really the only sphere left. Because I mean, when one looks at the world, one always looks up to US and its allies, and then there is China, who's our colossal enemy again. China and India are not friends, we are enemies, so we don't find anybody to like sort of be friends with. And you can't be aloof in this world. So somewhere I feel like Central Asia becomes a very important place because of these obvious reasons. And then of course one also realizes that there is a huge amount of Indian people and Indian diaspora living there. We also realize about how important Russia has been to us diplomatically. Tashkent revolution, one thinks of it, and time again Russia has been a huge friend to us and huge support to us, especially when India has been at war with Pakistan. Now, how is all of it affecting India? So here you're talking about the Great Himalayas, which are great, but side by you also have the Sulaiman ranges. Now, beneath the Sulaiman ranges, Afghanistan to Pakistan to India, you have three passes. As you can see, the Gomal, Khyber and Bolan passes. These are the passes that pass through Pakistan, Afghanistan, and from Afghanistan to Pakistan, and then from there to India. These are very, very strategically important places. These form a very important place because this is the trade route or the illegal sort of a land route that we have from Afghanistan to directly to Pakistan and then from there to India. We have Indus Valley, the Indus River. So basically the Indus River flows to Pakistan, to modern day Pakistan. Indus tributaries, Jhelum, Satluj, Beas, Ravi, all of these go through India today. So here you're talking about India being in a position where you do have the insurmountable huge barriers, then you also have the river system, and you have the not so great, not so large mountain ranges of Sulaiman ranges through which people can actually pass. Now Taliban, is famous for its terminology called as infiltration. Now infiltration is a very important word here, because A, there is a sort of an attack which is like, hey, I'm coming to attack you, we'll attack, we'll fight and we'll get lost. Then there is another sort of a very sliky, slimy way which China functions, which is very famously calls its own salami technique, where it sort of does not make a huge thing but slightly creates troubles for you, which is a Chinese technique where everywhere you're going, China will come, give you an issue, China will create barriers for you. That is Chinese style. Then you have infiltration. Basically, you're trying to occupy, you're coming in, you're trying to make this area yours, and you're not really attacking, but you're also attacking. You're trying to understand what I'm saying. Here, you're not really going and fighting all the time, but you're slowly making this territory your own. Sort of coming there and sort of inhabiting the place in a certain way where you are influencing the people to be yours, whether it's through power or whether it's through money or whether it's through absolute abuse of military, which I think is the case in the Taliban. There are these Khyber, Gomal and Bolan passes which make India a very vulnerable country, because Taliban directly, Afghanistan gets a passageway to India through which they can actually come here and infiltrate. Let us talk about our two very happy but not so happy neighbors, which we talk about, Pakistan and China. Now, we understand, each of us understand that there are border issues, but one also understand that these border issues are sort of surmounted and these issues become almost too big to deal with when you have foreign interventions. A very, very important word, foreign interventions. In 1972, when we signed a similar sort of convention, similar agreement with the Pakistan, we stated that, listen, we are a country that needs to, Kashmir is an issue that is between India and Pakistan. No other country in the entire world will get a say, not even the United Nations. Very important sort of a landmark point which Pakistan continues to sort of defy even now. It's remarkable how our foreign minister, Dr. Subramaniam Jaishankar, refuses to answer any question about Kashmir and saying it a bilateral issue, and one cannot emphasize this enough. In a very normal colloquial terminology, one realizes something that your parents always teach you when you're growing up, that घर की बात घर में ही रहनी चाहिए. Whatever you're talking about or whatever the issue that is in the house should remain in the house. Don't take it to outsiders. Same thing applies here. When a foreign intervention, whether it comes through a Afghanistan intervention or whether it comes to another kind of US and its allies and NATO and the sanctions and all of these sort of an intervention, all of it becomes a true world war situation. And one always wants to avoid war, one always wants to look after its people and sort of make sure that each and every one of us are safe and not really worried about the consequences of something as colossal as war. So when we are talking about all of these things, one also realizes that the geographical barriers are very important. The northeast of our country is sort of divided by the watershed boundaries. Watershed boundaries is basically the cracks that pass through the drainages system and the sort of the basins, the river basins, and from there whatever the land that is being sort of creamed and the breakage that happens because of the weathering and other kind of things, and because of which you do have a clear demarcation between land. That is how the boundaries were defined in the northeast. Sure, the northeast boundaries are sort of an issue. Assam is fighting with almost all of its neighbors. It has border issues with. But clearly, if we had gone for a sort of a watershed boundary issue for, say, suppose Kashmir, maybe situation could have been a slightly more easier to deal with, because you're dealing in geographical terms. Now, it's debatable. Well, clearly India doesn't buy the idea that Pakistan owes or wants or takes or whatever it is with Kashmir. It is ours, and that's about it. There's no more explanation to it. But one thing we do understand is that it takes a lot more than sort of ideas or like paper documents to really deal with an issue as big and magnanimous as an India-Pakistan Kashmir issue. And clearly geography complicates things. Geography definitely adds that layer of, say, dynamism, adds that layer of complexity, and it also makes for a very sort of a Herculean challenge. So So that always also reminds you that, they always say this is even when you're growing up, your parents must be telling you this, that, always be beware of your enemy, who is your neighbor. Like, somebody who's far away from you might not hurt you the way somebody very close to you can hurt. So clearly geography also tells the same thing. So here I think one realizes that these sort of mountain passes that pass through the regions of Kashmir and then obviously through Pakistan and Afghanistan make for a very like a sort of a curry of cultures and also definitely geopolitical challenge, which also means that India needs to be a lot more careful about how it's going to deal with its sort of a far distant enemy, not so enemy, friend, not so friend, Afghanistan. And that is why, if you realize that we've opened back-end diplomatic channels, and if you realize, because ever since the China issue has cropped up and China has been sitting on our head and really troubling us, if you've realized, the Narendra Modi, who's never wanted to talk about sort of Pakistan, who's never been friendly, who's always attacked the opposition over how it's dealt with sort of the Pakistan as an enemy, has actually not been saying so much, and it's actually ready to engage diplomatically. This, I think, teaches a very great lesson in geopolitics, that here even your enemy can be your not so enemy, because if you really see somebody else being a bigger threat to you, you make sure that you don't have multiple threats sort of stinging you at once. Because you can, if you're fighting, I can fight you here, but if I am 1, 2, 3 and I have enemies attacking me from all sides, it clearly is a very difficult situation, and one likes to ease out situations. So I feel like the geography mixed with a little bit of like sort of geopolitics makes for something, a very interesting study. And this is a sample. If one really dives in and learns about how much geography can influence geopolitics and how much sort of the history and the culture and the issues that are sort of in many ways can define our future, and if you can predict that, one can obviously be a lot more aware, and one can make sort of plans for their future in a lot more benefit way. We'll learn about that too, how geopolitics can help you, say something like household planning too, which I think is another very exciting topic. Right, that's all for today. I hope you've enjoyed and I hope you've learned something meaningful. Thank you so much.